Hello students, we are to start with Biographia Literaria chapter 14 that's prescribed for you, and in this chapter he speaks about Wordsworth the poet. So Coleridge, whereas is a poet, a critic and a philosopher, and Wordsworth on the other hand is a poet, and his creative faculty is far stronger than Coleridge's. And Wordsworth was also a critic, as we see him in the preface to the Lyrical Ballads, but he is termed as a lesser critic. And Coleridge had a rather wider range of knowledge that can be seen in his philosophical writings, and he was influenced by the German philosophers. That is, he believed that every individual has the spark of God in him or her. This is what the Germans had learned from their readings of the Indian Vedantic writings, and where they believe that the absolute self is realized, reflected in each one of us. That is, Atma is Paramatma and Paramatma is Atma. One in many and many in one. And this is what Coleridge also believes in. So Wordsworth and Coleridge, they in fact were are the early romantics, and they were writing, or they started writing in reaction to the new classical writings that dealt with the life of the elite class, that talked about coffee houses, fashionable society, city life, etc., etc. So Wordsworth and Coleridge, they wrote about the permanent things in life, quite in reaction to these writings or these neoclassical writings. So they wrote about the permanent things in life, like love and death, things that affected all human beings, things that had universality about it. So they said poetry and literature were not for the common people, so the language used in them should also be the language of the common ordinary people, and the subject matter used there should also be chosen from everyday life of these people. So they wrote about nature and about the people living in the lap of nature. In this chapter, poetry, language and subject matter of Wordsworth, they are objectively examined by Coleridge, and he finds faults with them all. So he is criticizing, he is not even sparing his friend Wordsworth, and because he, as a critic, is judging his friend quite objectively. So Coleridge also introduces the two different qualities of the mind, fancy and imagination. These two terms are introduced by him, and they are termed as two different qualities of the mind, and he defines them. Fancy and imagination, they were used interchangeably before him, and now he says that they are two separate qualities of the mind, and he defines them. He also talks about primary and secondary imagination in this essay, and defines what a poem is or what poetry is not. So he thus adds the dimension of philosophy to poetry and criticism. So in this chapter 14, Coleridge discusses in philosophical terms his views on nature and function of poetry. That is, he gives philosophic definitions of a poem and poetry with his interpretative comments. So he begins this chapter stating, during the first year that Mr. Wordsworth and I were neighbours, our conversations turned frequently on two cardinal points of poetry. So Wordsworth and Coleridge, they discuss together on these two cardinal points of poetry. the power of exciting the sympathy of the reader by a faithful adherence to the truth of nature. That is, poetry should be true to nature. It should appear realistic. And the power of giving the interest of novelty by the modifying colors of imagination. And through imagination, it should be imparted the power of, or the coloring of novelty. That is, it should appear, the charm of novelty should be provided to it through the poet's imagination. The sudden charm which accidents of light and shade, when light and shade falls on the natural objects, which moonlight or sunlight diffused over a known and familiar landscape, appeared to represent the practicability of combining both. So these two factors can be combined together in the form of poetry. So these are the poetry of nature. The thought suggested itself that a series of poems might be composed of two sorts. So to whom this idea appeared first is not very well remembered by Coleridge, but both of them consented upon the fact that there should be some poems written by them together, catering to these two qualities or these 2 points. So in the first case, the incidents and agents were to be in part at least supernatural. So here in the first kind of poetry that they were to compose, incidents and agents were thought to be taken from were to be supernatural, and the excellence aimed at was to consist in the interesting of the affections by the dramatic truth of such emotions as would naturally accompany such situations, supposing them real. So the supernatural was to be dealt with in such a convincing manner that it would appear to be real, and everybody would be convinced that whatever is being portrayed by the poet is real. And real in this sense, they have been to every human being who, from whatever source of delusion, has at any time believed himself under supernatural agency. And whenever a person who is under a state of delusion and he thinks or he feels as if he is under a spell of a supernatural agency, the kind of experience that he has, the kind of real experience that he has, that very kind of real experience should be portrayed in these kinds of poems that they would be composing, so that the supernatural could appear very convincing and natural. For the second class, subjects were to be chosen from ordinary life. The characters and incidents were to be such as will be found in every village. So everybody could relate themselves to these characters and incidents, because they would be so very familiar to them, as if they appeared in every village and its vicinity, where there is a meditative and feeling mind to seek after them. Wherever there is a meditative and feeling, emotional mind, a thoughtful mind, and an emotional mind, a passionate mind, who is in a position to appreciate these incidents and characters, or to notice them when they present themselves. So in this idea originated the plan of the lyrical ballads. So this was the idea behind the composition of the lyrical ballads, in which Wordsworth and Coleridge both contributed together. They wrote their own poems and they were compiled together in this compilation, Lyrical Ballads, in which it was agreed that my endeavors should be directed to persons and characters supernatural, or at least romantic, yet so as to transfer from our inward nature a human interest and a semblance of truth sufficient to procure for these shadows of imagination that willing suspension of disbelief for the moment which constitutes poetic faith. So these, the products of imagination, they are shadows, appearances. They acquire life or vitality and are suggestive of the original experience. These symbols are charged with a human interest because they indicate the highest moments of the human experience. So such moments, they carry with them a certain kind of truth, a certain conviction arising from feelings. So that is, if a person has really experienced these situations, they would be able to convey, or they would be in a position to relate themselves with the realistic description that has been made by the poet. So images by themselves, they do not reveal the poetic character. They become proofs of original genius only as far as they are modified by a predominant passion or emotion, or by associated thoughts or images awakened by that passion. And when a human and intellectual life is transferred to them from the poet's spirit or from the poet's imagination, there is a willing suspension of disbelief in the moment we go through such works. So when we go through such works where the supernatural has been treated in a very convincing manner, in a very humane approach is made, where it appears as if the experience and emotions that have been dealt with in the poem, they are real, they have been really experienced by people. There is a willing suspension of disbelief, that is, we are in a position to willingly suspend our disbelief and start believing in what the poet wants to convey. So the poetic faith, it can be realized only when there is neither an intellectual disbelief nor an emotional disbelief. So emotionally and intellectually, both ways, a person or the reader is convinced by the emotion, by the experience, the human experience that is conveyed through these shadows or appearances of imagination. So imagination harmonizes the intellect and the emotion. Deep thinking and deep feeling are therefore said to function together. So in this unity, we experience the essential nature of the soul. So this was his part. Coleridge's part is his contribution to the lyrical ballads. The poems that he was to compose were to deal with the supernatural in a very convincing manner, so that there was a willing suspension of disbelief achieved and poetic faith established. Mr. Wordsworth, on the other hand, was to propose to himself as his object to give the charm of novelty to things of every day, and to excite a feeling analogous to the supernatural, by awakening the mind's attention to the lethargy of custom and directing it to the loveliness and the wonders of the world before us. An inexhaustible treasure, but for which, in consequence of the film of familiarity and selfish solicitude, We have eyes yet see not, ears that hear not, and hearts that neither feel nor understand. So this was Wordsworth's role that he was to play. The character and privilege of genius is to carry the feelings of childhood into the powers of manhood, and the focusing of imagination on the familiar objects reveals their novelty, which evokes the feeling of wonder. So that is the familiar objects, when through imagination they are viewed, there is the charm of novelty, and this evokes a feeling of wonder. Just as a child, for him, when he sees things in this, he comes across new things in the universe, he is always wonderstruck. He is always there is always a sense of surprise in the eyes of the child, because he comes across things for the first time. And likewise, when these familiar things, they are presented in such a charming way, such a wonderful way, that the charm of novelty is rendered to them, that they appear to be so very novel to the readers that they are awestruck. They are struck with a sense of wonder, just like a child. So this feeling of wonder relates the genius to the child, and in expressing his experiences, the genius has a rare simplicity that is emerging from the freshness of the sensations and emotions. Whatever sensations he has, whatever emotions he has, through the freshness of these sensations and emotions, he is capable enough to providing through his imagination, the familiar things appear unfamiliar and charming, wonderful. So in this way, they would appear as if they are a feeling of supernatural would be created. So then the familiar truths, they strike us as new and powerful. So this is an essential feature of poetry. So these two kinds of poetry were to be presented in the lyrical ballads by the two friends Coleridge and Coleridge. Coleridge wrote The Ancient Mariner and a few other poems for the lyrical ballads, but his contribution in comparison to Wordsworth is very little in the lyrical ballads, and he felt as if his poems were mere interpolations. To this lyrical ballads, the second edition rather of the lyrical ballads, Wordsworth appended a preface which is of a considerable length, where he stated his poetic diction in reaction to the poetic diction of the neoclassical poets. And he said that the language of the common people, the language of real life, should be the appropriate language of poetry. And he rejects all kinds of phrases and forms of style that were not included in that language, that is the language of the common people. So this statement gave rise to a controversy, and critics discovered meanness of language and inanity of thought in Wordsworth's poems. But Coleridge, though he himself disagreed on various points on Wordsworth's poetic diction, but still he defends him against the violent attacks. And he says, had Mr. Wordsworth's poems been silly and childish as they are termed to be, they would have been long forgotten, they would have been long sunk into the slough of oblivion, that is the quagmire of oblivion, forgetfulness. They would have been long forgotten and never thought of, whereas his poems are widely read and appreciated. They are proof enough that his poems are not silly and childish as they are claimed to be, as they are criticized to be. So in this way he defends Wordsworth's poetry and his poetic diction, but on some points he differed, and he says, with many parts of this preface in the sense attributed to them, and which the words undoubtedly seem to authorize, they seem to approve, I never concurred, I never agreed, but on the contrary, I objected to them as erroneous in principle, wrong in principle, and as contradictory both in to other parts of the same preface. So in the same preface, Wordsworth himself contradicts his own views and to the author's own practice in the greater part of the poems themselves. And in his poems themselves, we find that Wordsworth himself is not fully abiding by his own poetic diction. Then in the chapter, Coleridge discusses the difference between a poem and a prose. So he says that in Coleridge's theory, we have the identity of form and content. He says that the elements, a poem and a prose writing, they both have almost the same elements, but their composition or the elements, they are combined together in varied proportions according to the object of the writer. Otherwise, there is hardly any difference between a poem and a prose piece. So the form is, he says that there is the form is mechanical, and it is when it is predetermined. It is something like the abstract metrical pattern in the case of a poem, and such a form presents only an association of the content with the form, and the resulting composition is the product of fancy only. So this association, he says, has to be transformed into a relation of unity. So the organic form is the expression of the imaginative activity on the part of a poet. The perfection of the organic form represents the stage of the identity of content and form. When the content and form, they are united together in an organic form, this gives rise to poetry. The organic form embodying a content offers the spirit of poetry, he says. And since this can be present in good literary prose also, prose is a form of poetry. So that he says, poetry is not the proper antithesis to prose, but it is contrary to science, because poetry is opposed to science, because science is regulated by the understanding and is thus devoid of the organic form. From this standpoint, Coleridge defines the poem as that species of composition which is opposed to works of science by proposing for its immediate object pleasure, not truth, and from all other species having this object in common with it, it is discriminated by proposing to itself such delight from the whole as is compatible with a distinct gratification from each component part. So a poem differs from science as far as its object is concerned. The object of science is truth, whereas the purpose of a poem is pleasure. So a proper poem for Coleridge is the one whose parts they mutually support and explain each other. A series of striking lines or rhyming lines which make a separate whole instead of a harmonizing part, these cannot be termed as a poem. Also, an unsustained composition from which the reader collects rapidly the general result, unattracted by the component parts, is not a poem in the real sense. So, if the component parts of a poem, they are not able to provide pleasure, or they are unable to attract the attention of the reader, then it is not a poem in the right sense. The reader should be carried forward not merely or chiefly by the mechanical impulse of curiosity or by a restless desire to arrive at the final solution, but by the pleasurable activity of the mind, excited by the attractions of the journey itself. So, the entire journey of reading the poem should be a pleasurable activity of the mind. Only then it can be termed as a poem. That is, each part of the poem should contribute to making it a harmonious whole, an organic whole. So, in an organic form, in an organic whole, all the component parts, they add or they are contributory to the very existence of that organic form. So, for the existence of the harmonizing whole that a poem is, all the components, all the parts of the poem, they need to contribute, or they are to provide pleasure to the reader, so that his entire journey becomes pleasurable. In short, whatever specific import we attach to the word poetry, there will be found involved in it as a necessary consequence that a poem of any length neither can be nor ought to be all poetry. Yet, if an harmonious whole is to be produced, the remaining parts must be preserved in keeping with the poetry. So, all the parts need to contribute together in order to make the poem a harmonious whole. Also, Coleridge doesn't believe in the instructive property of a poem. He doesn't believe that the object of poetry is to instruct or to make man morally better, as has been stated right from the days of Horace by Philip Sidney onwards to Dr. Johnson. But he says he believes that the pleasure is the primary object of poetry. So the truth it imparts comes to us through the medium of pleasure. And according to Coleridge, verisimilitude is not the end of poetry. He lays greater emphasis on its imaginative quality than on life-likeness. So a poem should be imaginary. So in order to know what poetry is, it is essential to examine the qualities and functions of a poet. The poet, described in ideal perfection, brings the whole soul of man into activity, with the subordination of its faculties to each other, according to their relative worth and dignity. So the entire soul, the whole soul of man, is involved in the act of creation. Coleridge ascertains that all art originates from imagination, and he examines the nature and function of imagination. He infers that fancy and imagination are two different things, whereas before Coleridge these two terms were used interchangeably, but he believes that they are different. So primary imagination is an act of creation. It expresses itself through inspiration. So because therefore it is a godlike quality. That is, God creates this universe. Whereas uh, a poet also is an inspired bard, and he becomes godlike when he creates poetry. So through the poet's supernatural powers, he gives expression to the ideas of life. So he is in a superior state of mind while he is creating. Whereas fancy, he says, only juxtaposes them according to memory and the laws of association. Fancy depends on memory. So things derived from memory, liberated from the restrictions of time and space. So from time immemorial, we have collected certain ideas, certain things we have stored in our memories, and they are subject to will and choice. So out of will and choice, we make use of those stored things in our memory through association, through the laws of association. So these prepare the necessary ground and supply the required material for the work of fancy. So in this way, Coleridge believes that these two faculties, they can and do exist together also. One is the basic faculty on which the other is founded. Spenser is believed to have fancy under conditions of imagination. So he was believed to have an imaginative fancy, but not imagination exactly. And Milton was believed to have a highly imaginative mind, whereas Cowley had a fanciful mind. So fancy here, as Coleridge believes, is a loose collection of the poet's heart and intellect, with the great appearances of nature in the shape of formal similes. The distinction between the primary and the secondary forms of imagination differentiates the unconscious from the conscious activity. So, imagination, according to Coleridge, is an intermediary, a link between subject and object, between mind and matter. It makes the perception of outer reality possible. In this regard, he says, there are evidently two powers at work, which relatively to each other are active and passive, and this is not possible without an intermediate faculty which is at once both active and passive. In philosophical language, we must denominate this intermediate faculty in all its degrees and determinations the imagination. So this imagination links the mind to the matter. It links the subject to the object. It links the poet to the outer reality. So the primary imagination, the Coleridge holds it to be the living power and prime agent of all human perception, and as a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. The I am is the same as spirit, self, self-consciousness, that is conscious of the fact that I am part of the greater reality, Atma and Paramatma. So the poet in a state of creation is an inspired bard. He becomes godlike, and just as God has created the universe, the poet in an inspired state is also in a position to create something new. And in this supernatural state of mind, here when he has supernatural powers, he gives expression to the ideas of life. And the secondary imagination he considers as an echo of the former. of the primary, yet still as identical with the primary in the kind of its agency, and differing only in degree and in the mode of its operation. Imagination, whether primary or secondary, it unifies sense impressions into an organic pattern. Primary imagination makes the ordered perception of objective reality possible. So through primary imagination, the poet perceives the objective reality and stores its images in the memory, which without it would appear as a blurred chaos. So nature is the art of God. So nature is the creation of God. The divine consciousness is objectified in nature. So nature is a reflection of God's creation, and through God's presence, God's consciousness, and through the vital agency of primary imagination, the divine act of creation in the external is repeated in the human mind. So in the human mind, it makes an imprint, that is the the divine consciousness objectified in nature is perceived by the poet through his primary imagination and stored imprinted in his mind. The secondary imagination is a vital process like the primary imagination, and it creates order out of a chaos of sense impression, but it does not act involuntarily. That is, it is dependent on human will. That is, the poet is willing to create something. It resynthesizes the sense impressions coming from objective reality according to the principle of beauty. It is at the root of all artistic activity. As Scott James points out, its function is to diffuse, dissolve and recreate, to make the external internal, fashioning new images in its own semblance, in its own effort to become divine. So it cannot be content only to copy. In all artistic creation, there will be imitation, but not copying. Imitation consists both of likeness and unlikeness, or sameness and difference. So the imagination of the creative artist is secondary. The imaginative activity explains, or rather in the secondary imagination, it explains how the world of experience is to be grasped in a fuller unity, so that we can have a significant experience of reality. It grasps the whole in which it functions purposively. So it is an awareness of the end that is realized in the secondary imagination. So this secondary imagination, it breaks up the original perception, and that is made by the primary imagination. So through the primary imagination, the initial perception is made, the original perception is made, and then it is constructed into a new one through the secondary imagination, through all the imprints that are stored in the human mind. So it dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to recreate. All those stored memories, all those stored images, they are once again revitalized, recreated. They are diffused, dissolved, dissipated into one another, and a new composition is made, where this process is rendered impossible, yet still at all events it struggles to idealize and to unify. This is what Coleridge says. It is essentially vital, even as all objects are essentially fixed and dead. Both the primary and the secondary are constructive imaginations. They are constructive, but it is the latter that is also destructive. So the secondary imagination is destructive as well as constructive. The struggle to unify is the absorption of experiences into a whole. The poet feels the need to create a coherent whole, and he embodies the experience in an all-inclusive pattern. So in realizing this, it destroys the isolation of the objects. The creative activity brings forth a charm of novelty. So something new is created out of these stored images. From the imitation and copying of these stored images, an artistic creation is made. A new whole emerges. So artistic creation is possible only when the existing staleness and ugliness are eliminated. Secondary imagination makes it possible for the poet to lend a new charm of novelty to objective reality. According to him, imagination reveals itself in the balance or reconcilement of opposite or discordant qualities, of sameness with difference. So it makes a balance between the opposites, of the general with the concrete, the idea with the image, the individual with the representative, the sense of novelty and freshness with old and familiar objects, a more than usual state of emotion with more than usual order, judgment ever awake and steady self-possession with enthusiasm and feeling profound or vehement and strong, and while it blends and harmonizes the natural and the artificial, still subordinates art to nature, the manner to the matter, and our admiration of the poet to our sympathy with the poetry. So this is what the secondary imagination does. So, and then the Coleridge ends the chapter with this statement: finally, good sense is the body of poetic genius. So a poetic genius should have good sense, and this good sense should be draped, should be clothed with fancy. Fancy, its drapery, its clothing, its ornamentation. Motion, its life, and it should be full of motion, and imagination, the soul that is everywhere. And in each, and because of this imagination, this body of poetic genius is alive, or it has its existence, and this forms all into one graceful and intelligent whole that we call as an organic form or a creative whole.